I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett
at
at
the
the
Movies.
movies.
Hello, everyone. We are reviewing Cold War, the Best Foreign Language nomination, and the surprise nominee for Best Director for Paweł Pawlikowski. Also, we'll be in our movie club entry, we'll be talking about Casablanca, 1942's Casablanca, the great Casablanca. And then, if you hadn't heard, Liam Neeson said some stuff, and we'll be talking about it. So let's get into Cold War. This is a long-ranging, wide-ranging story starting in the 1950s of a music director at a school who falls in love with a student at that school. And this film tracks their romance over the course of probably about a decade and a half. It stars Joanna Kulig and Tomasz Kote, I could be mistaken on that, and Boris Zik. This is pronouncing Polish names. I'm not so good at it. So anyway, I know you have a lot to say about this film, Garrett. So I'm going to turn it over to you real quick. What did you think?
Well, when I first left the theater, I was moved by, I think, the beauty of the cinematography and the music. I was a little puzzled by a few parts, some things I didn't really understand, and I thought about them more, and I came home and started looking some stuff up. And as I was unspooling it, I came to realize that this movie, I think, is actually a very courageous film. And there's a lot going on that you might not know if you go into it completely cold and you know nothing about what's happened, either what happened in Poland during the actual Cold War or what's going on in Poland nowadays. But when I was able to sort of put that context together, I came around to thinking this film is not just good. I think this film is great. And I'm happy to unpack that. Obviously, I'm teasing a lot there, but before I delve into it, because it might be a bit of a deep dive, I want to hand it over back to you to give your sort of overall general impressions of the film.
Sure. Okay. I'm actually really interested to hear what you have to say about this, because there's a lot of this film that seemed it's a very focused film. It's not dealing with a lot of social or political backdrop directly. That's certainly in the background of a lot of what's going on in this film, but a lot of the action is just on this one relationship, and it's focused on this one relationship between these two characters. And there's a certain moment at the end of Act One where she does a thing that lost a great deal of sympathy and empathy for me as an audience member. And as a result of that, when he continues to pursue her in Acts 2 and 3, I found myself a little bit more detached from the character than I wanted to be. And that when he pursues a thing that we believe he shouldn't be pursuing, our empathy and our sympathy for his journey becomes a little bit stunted and a little less. So that moment at the end of Act One that never really was explained well enough for me. Like they do address it, but they don't explain it well enough for me to really attach my sympathy back into this relationship. That moment kind of turned me off and kept me at distance from it. That said, so that's my kind of negative experience with the film. The positive experiences are obviously the cinematography. I think it was also nominated for Best Cinematography. It deserves it. It's great cinematography. It's really good. The performances are captivating, especially Joanna Kulig, who basically reminds me of Jennifer Lawrence every time I watch her. I don't know if it was the same for you, but as soon as I saw her on screen and some of her actions, I was like, oh my God, it's Polish Jennifer Lawrence. I thought she was really good. I also liked a metaphorical element of the story that it always seemed as though these characters were putting on personalities and putting on faces and putting on kind of an imagined idea of what Poland is and what certain aspects of identity are. And I thought that was an interesting kind of metaphorical and thematic touch that runs through the entire thing. It's almost as though all identity was costume in this thing. And I like that theme and how that theme was developed. So those are my three things that I really came away from this film with. It was a film that didn't totally work for me, but it's a film whose artistry and whose skill behind the camera I certainly recognize and appreciate.
Yeah. So echoing some of what you said, I know exactly what moment you're talking about, and I understand why it alienated you. That it didn't quite alienate me as much, but it definitely had me scratching my head, and several other moments, driven largely by the character of Zola, who was played by Joanna Cooling. A lot of her behavior puzzled me and frustrated me in some ways. And that was one of the things which led me to think about it more, which again, I'm going to return to that later. But just again, the technical merits. Yeah, the cinematography is just absolutely gorgeous. The black and white, the high contrast, the incredible camera angles. Yeah, I mean, it was just a very visual film. I mean, there's the line about every frame a painting. This one felt more like every frame just a stunning black and white, gorgeous photograph. And something you didn't mention, but I think definitely deserves a lot of praise. I thought the music was fantastic. And I have no particular, affiliation with Polish folk music. I slightly more with jazz, but not much. But the evolution of the songs over the course of this 15 years, and the way it sort of parallels in some ways their relationship, and hearing these tunes, which you start to get attached to over and over again, and in all their different modalities, I thought was just both brilliant as a device in the film and just a gorgeous thing to experience. I am listening to the soundtrack, and it's wonderful, absolutely, again, something totally elevated the film for me. So that was another point of praise I have to shout out.
Yeah, it's I agree with you about the music. I was almost as I said last week, I knew nothing about this film going into it. So when they started singing, I'm like, oh shit, it's a musical. This is awesome. And then of course it shifted and became this sort of all relationships are bad drama. Although that's probably a reductive stage. But yeah, I'm really curious about your reaction, like the research that you did and kind of unpacking this film. I'm go ahead and talk for an hour about that.
All right. So a couple of disclaimers. One, our reviews are always non-spoilery, and it's going to be hard for me to fully make this analysis without spoiling. So if I stumble over some points or allude to some things, so you can appreciate the film on its own merits, that might undercut the poignancy of my analysis. But I'm doing it to preserve our audience's experience of the film if they haven't seen it yet.
Sure.
So please allow me a certain amount of leeway for that. Another thing to point out is that I am no expert on Polish politics, either during the Cold War or now. Take everything I'm about to say with a grain of salt. Look into it yourself, please. It's entirely possible that I've misread this material, that I don't understand what I'm talking about. And, if anyone wants to leave a comment correcting me below, especially if you can point me to some sources, I would very much like to look into it, because I don't know enough about this and I would like to know more. That having been said,
disclaimers over.
One of the things which struck me was that the film was clearly counting on the audience to understand how ugly things were in Poland during the Cold War. They did very, very little, almost nothing at all, to explicitly state that. Now, that's probably fairly well, common enough knowledge even for American audiences. They may not know so much about Poland particularly, but they know enough about communism and the Iron Curtain and Soviet Russia and so forth. Knowing those things can extend easily well enough to Poland of the time. Now, as I found myself puzzling why they didn't make that more explicit, why they didn't show how ugly and how awful things were, I started to remember that I'd heard some things about the current direction of where the Polish government has been heading. And in short, it has been taking a very hard right-wing turn. They have been breaking down many civil liberties and protections for the press and for artists. And they've been making very much an illiberal turn, flirting, possibly even, I'm not sure if it's unfair to characterize it as flirting with outright fascism, which is obviously scary, both because it's returning to the ugliness of what we saw during the Cold War, but under a different guise. It's not under communism; it's under fascism. So I came home and I looked stuff up, and I found out that Pawlikowski. Gosh, I wish I could do.
Yeah, Paul Pawlikowski, sort of an Eric Erickson, except for
Pawlikowski. For his last film, again, which was won the Academy Award for Ada, the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. He explicitly said that he was blacklisted by the government of Poland for making this film. Now he lives in England. He lives, so it's not necessarily that the stormtroopers are going to kick down his door or anything like that. But clearly, he very much is still connected with Polish culture. It runs all the way throughout this film and Polish history. And he also said specifically that he doesn't set out to make political films. He's not trying to be a political filmmaker. He's trying to tell human stories, but human stories that take place against the backdrop of real human structures, including in this case, the history of Poland's place during the Cold War. So for him to make this movie after being put on the spot by the government of his home country, and to do it in a way that almost sort of dares the Polish government to react to it, to say, look, I'm not calling you fascist. I'm assuming the whole world knows you're fascist, and they know what a terrible place it was during the Cold War, and I'm going to use that unspoken element to just hold a mirror up to the direction you're heading now. Now, again, Pawlikowski did not say it this way. I'm interpreting this, and it's all art. I could be getting this wrong. I don't know if this is intention, but that's what it made me think, and that's what I kept coming back to, was that this is art of resistance. This is art that, even though it's not trying to be political, is showing that the politics in a time like the one in which we're living now, and especially if you're living in Poland, cannot help but be. And it made me think of great works of art that came out of behind the Iron Curtain. The plays of, oh gosh, what's his name? The absurdist playwright.
Ionesco.
He's great too. But no, the other one. East German, I think. Or
I thought I got it with Ionesco.
No,
Solzhenitsyn's work is not. He's not a playwright, but that's an example of really good art that comes out of the Iron Curtain. I'm gonna stall and let you look up exactly who you're trying to.
Bertolt Brecht.
Oh, Bertolt Brecht. Yeah. Okay. Of course.
Now, one of my favorite Brecht quotes: "Art is not a mirror. Art is a hammer." And I kept coming back to this because one of the things that, again, I could entirely be overinterpreting this or reading too much into it, but what I felt like with Pawlikowski is he was pulling off both at the same time. He was using it as a mirror that acted as a hammer, as a response to being blacklisted by his own government. And that is something that is going to just make me stand up and applaud and really, really love that someone can do that with a film. Now, again, I think this analysis would make a lot more sense if we could talk spoilers, if you had seen the film. But again, I'm going to refrain from going into those details. So if you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. I think you should. You can take my analysis for what it's worth. You can guys say take it with a grain of salt. I'm definitely going out on a few limbs in giving that. But I think when you see at least several key scenes, I hope my analysis will resonate.
It does to me, even though some of that background that you were talking about didn't is not sort of on my radar, not stuff that I'm terribly familiar with. I did realize that there were some troubles in Poland currently, although I'm more focused on the U.S. Politics and our flirts with pseudo-fascism. So I but now that I think it's not a spoiler to say that even from in the first act, like I consider spoilers to be anything after the first act. And so even in the first act, I think you can see some elements of this being a toxic relationship between these two people. And I can understand how you would then be able to draw a parallel in the sense that the Joanna Kulig character, Zola, or Zula rather, that she is sort of representative of his home country, and then he is the Victor character who is both drawn to her and then also fucked over by her. So I can see some of those metaphorical things working even in the relationship in the first act in stuff that I can talk about to an audience who hasn't seen the film. So I like your analysis. I think there's a lot about it that makes a lot of sense to me. Like you, I think we both need to go study our Polish history and report back. But maybe that's not things to do when we have stacks of papers to grade and shit like that. So, but yeah, that's I think you make a lot of sense there. I'd love to disagree with you, but I can't right now. What any other thoughts about this film before we kind of wrap up? Or
I was again curious about sort of as a feminist lens.
oh, good.
I felt that on the one hand, Zola had a lot of agency. Clearly, she was far less passive than I think a lot of a lot of portrayals of women from that period of time may have lined up. At the same time, her agency is oftentimes exercised in ways that at least to me seemed hard to quite reconcile and quite understand. I felt that she was acting in ways that were, not necessarily self-destructive, then maybe, but harsh, cruel, capricious, and ultimately hurtful for no purpose that I could discern. And as I was sitting there, I'm saying, well, I'm wondering if I'm only seeing it that way because I'm a man, and I can't scrutinize her perspective. And I saw it by myself. I did not see it with my wife, but I would have liked a woman's perspective on the character.
Sure.
To sort of possibly check against or round out what my thinking was. So that again, that's another element that had me puzzled, why some of the decisions she made, why she made them, and to what extent is it a reflection of my own experiences that I wasn't able to fully understand them.
Yeah, I think that's similar to kind of my resistance at the end of the first act. I mean, I wanted a little bit more kind of exploration of that decision and how she I'll buy whatever they tell me. I just needed them to tell me a little bit more. And go ahead.
I was going to say, one of the things that Pawlowski said in an interview is that he deliberately wanted to leave large chunks of the story out and let the audience fill them in.
And
he said he resisted A, B, C, D storytelling where it's cause and effect. He didn't want this to be a biopic where you were able to trace everything. He wanted to cut out sections and allow you to imagine what happened in between.
He succeeded at that, definitely. So what would you give this out of 5? It sounds like this might be one of the highest.
Yeah, it's hard to say for sure because, like I say, it's the more I think about it, the more I like it. When I left the theater, I think it was like 3.5. At the moment, I'm probably going to give it a 4, but it's entirely possible that it might round up to 4.5 as the more I reflect on it, and the more I look into it. So yeah, so far this has been one of the best films of the year for me.
Okay, yeah. It's 3.5 for me right now, but probably because I am where you were right after you saw the film. So it's 3.5 for me. I'm not gonna put it in my honorable mentions for the best of the year. But I liked it. I just didn't love it. So yeah, okay. Now on to a film that I do love more than almost anything else. Casablanca. This was a film that I like as I was watching Cold War. You had said last week that there was a review that compared Cold War to Casablanca. Um, I can kind of see that, but because it's sort of like one set of relationships, means something else. Like one set of relationships is indicative of a larger cultural movement and is indicative of wartime and all of that. So I can kind of see that, but there's so much about Casablanca that moves so well that this is one of those films that A to B to C kind of plot, and its plot is both complex and easy to follow and really, really compelling. The characters are all absolutely wonderful. Count the number of quotable lines from this film. I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship. Play it, Sam, play as time goes by. On and on and on. Even the ones that are less quoted. I've got this gun aimed right at your heart. That's my least vulnerable spot. I mean, these are all some of the best lines. Round up the usual suspects, which of course led to The Usual Suspects. Yeah. So all of these moments of this film, the moments of this film are incredible. The characters of this film are incredible. The story makes it. I am just gonna blab about how much I love this movie for the next hour. But I should shut up and let you talk for a little bit. Tell me what you think of Casablanca. Thought of Casablanca.
Yeah. This is a film that that lives up to the hype. I mean, it's obviously frequently cited as one of the best films ever made, a classic and so forth. And when you have the bar that high, it's oftentimes that you come away thinking, well, it was good, but it wasn't as good as everybody said. And this one, it does. It's yeah, everything you say. The setting, the story world is very, very compelling. Obviously, I mean, the fact that this film was made while World War II was still going on is something worth keeping in mind. The sort of the political backdrop, the human tragedy that's behind everything, the risks, the danger, the acting, of course. Humphrey Bogart is Humphrey Bogart, right? It's it earns his reputation through and through. It has this sort of tragic inertia to it that even though how it's going to end because everyone knows how it ends, you can see how it gets carried away in such a way that the original audience might not have known. So it could have been a very, very sort of satisfying uncertainty going on there. But even when you know how it's going to end, you feel the emotional gravity in both directions, and you feel the sort of the tragedy at the heart of it, that no matter what decision is made, something heartbreaking is going to play out. And it's a story about this is not my analysis, this is an old analysis, but I think it's a right one. The conflict between sort of romanticism and classicism, right? The sort of cold, German rationalism, right? Of thinkers like Kant, against sort of a more sort of French, Jean-Jacques Rousseauian romanticism, and whether the romanticism is going to triumph over that rationalistic cynicism. It was great watching those sort of those ideas and those emotions play out, and embodied in the conflicts in the story. So yeah, no, it's I mean, you mentioned all the quotable lines and how many of the lines were made into to film titles themselves. In that respect, it's much like Shakespeare, and it deserves all the praise that it gets.
Yeah, I mean, and what's this? It's almost a miracle that this film is not only that this film got made, that this film is as good. Not only that this film is as good as it is, that it got made at all. Like they didn't know how to end it. They were writing the ending while production was going on, which is and to nail the ending the way they did. I almost feel like the writers are kind of like Bogey in that one scene. Like, I gotta figure this out. You, Rick, you do all the thinking for us, as Ingrid Bergman says, which is probably the only thing that I have against this film is the fact that she kind of just gives up her agency. That's it. And you talked about the context of this film, 1942. This is that kind of lends some pathos to the Marseillaise scene where they're in the bar and they start singing the French national anthem.
Mm-hmm.
That's that's a moment of the film that always brings tears to my eye, and it's got a incredibly diverse cast. I mean, Peter Lorre is from Austria-Hungary, well, Slovakia now. Humphrey Bogart, American. Ingrid Bergman, Swedish. Paul Henreid from Austria-Hungary now is Italy, etc., etc. There's the diversity of this cast. Yes, they're all, except for Dooley Wilson, all white people, but nationalistic diversity. I think that's an important thing within the context of when this film was made. That this is kind of an all throughout the world we are resisting the Nazis, and that they're all throughout the world. Other countries are coming together to make this movie that is so anti-Nazi, and I think it works on just every level.
And it is worth noting that the director, Michael Curtiz, is Hungarian, Hungarian born, and so naturally, fighting the Nazis is going to be something that was very much in the forefront of his consciousness.
Claude Rains British, yeah. Like there's all kinds of yeah. It's such a diverse cast in terms of its nationality, and it comes together in this place called Casablanca. So it's kind of metaphorical how Casablanca within the film serves as a sort of way station for Europeans fleeing to America, and yet in America, a group of diverse nationalities came to this film to make this anti-Nazi film, which it's, as I said, it just works on every level. Rick is a hero. He's one of my early film heroes, not only in his gruff cynicism at the beginning, which I identify with, but also his kind of turn to the romantic toward the end, which I also identify with. I love how that character, Bogey plays that character so perfectly, because both of those moments are so true. And I think that's a testament to Humphrey Bogart as an actor, not just a movie star. There are people who sort of write him off as just a movie star, but he is not. He is a fine talent. And Ingrid Bergman, she is delightful and beautiful in this role, and she brings a strength and intelligence and also a vulnerability to Elsa that I always find very compelling. She in this and Notorious are two of my favorite roles of hers, although she's been in some other good stuff too.
And a note here, as I'm perusing the IMDb page, to aspiring filmmakers, this film did not make money.
Right.
So even if your movie is a bomb, it doesn't mean it's not wonderful.
Right. Yeah, and it didn't win. If I recall correctly, it didn't win Best Picture, or if I recall correctly, oh no, it did. It won Best Picture, Best Director, and Best Screenplay. It was Bogey, Claude Rains, and Ingrid Bergman wasn't even nominated. So yeah, it's an absolute delightful human film that I love so much. So I give this. Do you want to say anything more before I give it 5 stars? Of course.
Yeah, a few minor criticisms, which are less problems with the film per se and more just things that I didn't care for too much about it. I mean, you did note that Ingrid Bergman did kind of sacrifice her her agency or surrender it. Again, one could say that was again fairly realistic for the time or something like that. Where, but nonetheless, yeah, rubs me the wrong way. I also didn't like the score. I felt that, I mean, again, it was, it's one of the things that stopped the film from being timeless for me. Is that, every time there's one of these sort of transition scenes and you have this orchestral swell up over it, that screamed to me 1940s filmmaking. And for some movies that's not a problem, but for this one, again, this is a film, I think, which, by reputation has transcended its own time period, but that score kept pulling me back to its time period, and I didn't like that sort of disorientation. Like I say, it's not so much a problem for the film, more a matter of like sort of purely personal aesthetic taste on my part. But nonetheless, I did feel it was, if you're looking for something to criticize, that's the sort of thing I would criticize.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the score is certainly of its time, but that didn't. I don't know if I don't know if I'm asking the film to have like every film can have the Godfather score.
Right. It's not just the score, but it's how the score is used. It's
True.
in these segue scenes and these transitions from one part to the next. It was jarring for me. That's the kind of technique that they used in the 1940s and maybe the 50s, and I don't. Filmmakers don't really do that anymore, and so it felt not out of place for its own film, but it struck me as anachronistic.
Yeah, and there's also that really bad narration at the beginning that you just, show up 2 minutes late to the film and
Feels like a movie reel, yeah.
Right.
A newsreel, rather.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm 5 stars all the way on this. What do you think?
I give it 4.5. Yeah.
Okay.
It's again, like I say, it's a film that lives up to its hype.
What is a 5-star film for you, Garrett?
Well, Silence, right?
Okay, yeah.
Both stars. Shawshank Redemption is 5-star film, so.
You're a little bit more stingy with your 5 stars than I am. I think I've given multiple films 5 stars in this podcast, whereas I don't think you've given anything 5 stars, which is certainly your prerogative, good sir. Okay, let's talk about The Thing. Okay, so in an interview with The Independent, Liam Neeson says some stuff. This has sort of blown up on Twitter, and Liam Neeson was on GMA earlier this morning clarifying his comments, but the original comments tell a story, and I'm not going to read all of them, but they tell a story of Liam Neeson coming upon a close friend, who was the victim of sexual assault, of rape. And Liam Neeson responds that his immediate reaction was one of primal rage, in which he then acted upon that rage by asking he clarifies in his GMA interview earlier this morning that he asked all of the descriptions of this particular assailant. He is told that the assailant is a black person, and as a result of that, I'm going to directly quote him at this time. I went up and down areas with a kosh. Kosh is like a crowbar or a bludgeon of some kind, hoping I'd be approached by somebody. I'm ashamed to say I did it for maybe a week, hoping some Neeson gestures, air quotes with his fingers, black bastard would come out of a pub and have a go at me about something, so that I could, another pause, kill him. He later says, and this is very important for the context, it took me a week, maybe a week and a half to go through that. She would say, where are you going? I would say, I'm just going out for a walk, what's wrong? No, nothing's wrong. It was horrible when I think back that I did that. And I've never admitted that. I'm saying it to a journalist, God forbid. It's awful, but I did learn a lesson from it when I eventually thought, what the fuck are you doing, And the end quote. So he's talking about this sort of race-based issue, which some people have certainly responded to by calling Liam Neeson a racist. He has said that he's not a racist in the GMA comments. Some other people have said that Liam Neeson is actually telling a story, a redemption story about how he is admitting his racist thoughts, acknowledging how horrible they are, and then responding to them by self-improvement. And so for those critics, it's it's brave of Neeson to come out with this. All of that is well. Garrett, do you want to say anything before I go on to the part that I really want to talk about?
Well, yeah. Suffice to say, obviously, it's really ugly and unfortunate. Yeah. Again, I try actively to be very race conscious and to sort of stay in my lane, as it were, to not form opinions about things that I don't have lived experiences about beyond what I can sort of reliably glean from what other people say. So sort of all those qualifications. Yeah, I'm obviously not not a person who is in a position to give any sort of definitive thoughts on this topic. Right. But it does seem to me that I am glad that Neeson is sort of at least sort of trying to acknowledge the ugliness in his past, and if not necessarily apologize for it, use it as maybe, I don't know, teachable moments about how to reconcile yourself to the ugly parts of your own soul. And perhaps from his publicist probably would have preferred it if he hadn't done it publicly. But
I'm sure his publicist just got a new refill on his blood pressure pills after this thing this thing was going down. Yeah, it's look, I think the conversation about race and Liam Neeson's and his behavior and his comments is a worthy conversation that people can have, and we're probably not as qualified to talk about it as some other people who are having some intelligent conversations about this. However, what is interesting to me, and what I think speaks to a little bit more about film studies and our ethical interactions with movies, is what he says later. I think it's right and fine that the earlier comments in the interview are the ones that gain the most press and the most traction and the most rage tweeting and defense tweeting on Twitter. But what has gotten ignored is one of the things that he says later. This is I'm quoting from the article again in The Independent. Let me just pause to say that Clemence McCallan, I may be mispronouncing your name, but I think you're an incredible writer and a great journalist. I think this article is really well written. In Cold Pursuit, the son of his character, Nels Coxman, is killed by a drug gang, sparking a desire for revenge. I think audience members live to see that violence on screen, Neeson continues. They can kind of live vicariously through it. People say, yeah, but violence in films make people want to go out and kill people. I don't believe that at all. I think the average moviegoer thinks, yeah, punch him. And they get a satisfaction out of seeing somebody else enacted. And they leave the theater and they feel satiated in that way, in some way. And close quoting there. Like, that's an interesting expression about how art serves society and how we as film goers interact with film. And so I'd like to spend some time just talking about that idea of a cathartic reaction to seeing violence on screen. Garrett, what do you think?
Yeah, I hadn't heard that part of the story because obviously it was, or the interview, because it was overshadowed by the other parts. But when you quoted it to me, my immediate reaction was, well, that's Aristotle. That's exactly what Aristotle says in the Poetics 2,400 years ago. That we go to art to sort of rid ourselves of these primal urges, to expurgate our, our rage, our lust, our anger, whatever, precisely so we can go back and then be civilized in our daily life. And that was, the value of art, or one of the values of art for Aristotle, was that it allowed us to live vicariously and to live out the things that we're not allowed to live out. Of course, Freud also sort of spun this in his own way as well. And then, later on, I can't remember who it is that someone developed a corollary to the term cathexis, or catharsis, with the term cathexis, which instead of purging an emotion is when you invest emotion by way of artwork. And so, there's, millions of essays written in art criticism, film criticism, about sort of dueling understandings of how catharsis works. And then, of course, there's a sort of culture war backdrop. Obviously, films like Natural Born Killers inspired many a think piece about precisely this issue that Neeson is bringing up. So it's it's in many ways a eternal polemic, and one that I'm always interested in talking about and framing in Aristotelian terms, as is my wont to do. So that's my sort of overall framing of the issue. Let me put it back to you with the question: what do you think, Jim? Do you think that Neeson is basically right here or not?
I don't necessarily think that he's right. Like, I certainly understand how people can receive film that way. However, the thing that I go back to is a David Foster Wallace quote in his essay about David Lynch, and this is the direct quote: "We're so relentlessly set up to approve of the villain's bloody punishment in the climax that we might as well be wearing togas." And the idea of creating violent film as a sort of modern day Colosseum, with all of the Colosseum's associated moral issues and ethical issues, I think is not something that I'm very comfortable with. I'm not very comfortable with the idea that we as film goers, when we watch a violent film, are like, yeah, punch him, kick his ass, I want to see his head explode, blah 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 blah. Like, I think that that's it may be exorcising a moral, exorcising a moral valve in the Freudian sense, but I don't. But there are other ways of looking at emotions and violent tendencies that mean that we have to sort of not, by exorcising that valve, we then close it shut again, and then we set ourselves to be built up with more rage afterwards. And that seems to be a problem with our consumer culture, and also a problem with how we are depicting rage and how we are depicting violence. We live in one of the more violent societies. We live in a very violent society with 22,000 gun murders per year, and that I think that it's naive to say that the fact that our art depicts the normative solution to characters' problems being violence doesn't have something to do with that. That's not to say that I'm against violent film or that I'm against violence in movies. I just think that automatically positioning an audience member as somebody wearing a toga and pushing for that violence is a little bit of a problematic point of view.
So, pedantic as hell correction here. Only Roman citizens wore togas, and they wouldn't have worn them to the Colosseum. The Colosseum was a place of it's not that citizens wouldn't go to the Colosseum, they would, but they wouldn't go in togas. Togas was like a business suit,
David apologizes from the grave.
Yeah. But no, but when he read me the quote, I thought he meant that we were all like, assassinating Julius Caesar together, was how I interpreted that.
It's in context, it's Colosseum, in terms of the watching violence and enjoying the violence.
Fair enough. But to your point, I recall something you said before. I'm paraphrasing you, but I think, correct me if I don't have your sentiment wrong. One of the things that you don't like in a lot of films is that violence just becomes the easy solution, not only for the characters but also for the screenwriters. You
Right.
got a problem, you don't know what else to do. Well, just have one character shoot another, start an action sequence. It's cheap, it's easy, it doesn't require any particular talent as a writer. The really great films are the ones that sort of acknowledge the reality and sometimes even the necessity of violence, but does so in a way where it's handled with more sort of grace and more
Yeah.
subtlety. I know we talked about the film A History of Violence before. This is a film I think which pulls that off quite nicely.
I agree.
So to your sentiment, I mean, again, the critical sentiment, as this is always the case, right? There are almost always the case with the yin and the yang. The counter Aristotle point comes from Plato. Plato specifically wanted to censor violent artwork precisely because he was afraid that it would encourage violence in people. He sort of had a monkey see, monkey do thought that citizens raised on violent plays and poems would be more likely to engage in violence. Myself, and again, this is somewhat obviously of a social scientific question, which I am not, and again, I think I can't speak with any sort of authority on. But I mean, you mentioned that 22,000 gun deaths every year. That's bad. But when you consider the fact that we have a population of 325 million, that's not that many gun deaths. I mean, more certainly than our compatriots and other comparable countries. But still, as a percentage of people dying, that's a very, very, very small amount, and much smaller than most of human history. Now, it's a different story if you look at all violent deaths, of course, than just guns.
Mhm.
But suffice to say, I mean, again, as an empirical question, it seems to me, I think our media is very violent. And if there was any kind of clear direct correlation between consuming violent media and there being violence, I would expect there to be a lot more violence today than we actually see. And we don't really see that much. Now, granted,
Right.
of course, there's multiple factors which can go into this. I don't think anyone is naive enough to think it's a direct thing. You watch violent movies and then you go out and fight people or
Yeah,
kill
yeah,
people.
yeah. And I'm not making that argument either. Like, I'm not making the violent video games cause, school shootings are like, no, I'm not making that argument. But what I am making, the argument that I am making is a little bit more nuanced than that. I'm saying that the normative solution to characters' problems in many American films is violence. And if we train people to solve their problems via violence, then that has an effect on how we negotiate the planet and how we negotiate each other. It's not just a game like Fortnite causes people. No, of course, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that if you only show people solving their problems through violence, that's going to have an effect on the society that's created. And so the idea that Neeson and therefore Aristotle are both casting us and casting violence in film as this sort of pressure valve release, as this cheering violence on, is something that troubles me. Of course, I I'm not going to go on to the Plato side of things and say, well, we have to censor all violence. No, I'm saying that we have to have violence being portrayed in film that has consequences. That the consequences of violence are seen as awful and regrettable and full of context. I think Natural Born Killers has a point, and is a film worthy of watching, because it's deliberately interrogating its violence, even though that is a super ultra violent movie. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I mean, again, as you sit there talking, I'm reminded again of the history of violence. There's few films that talk about the consequences of violence in a more sort of long-lasting, inescapable way
Right.
than that. At least in recent memory, my recent memory, at least. And of course, also again back to Shakespeare, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is part. Shakespeare. A lot of Shakespeare's plays are very, very violent, very, very bloody. But there is a very clear moral context to it. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously, this is not a debate that we're going to be able to settle tonight. It's been being had for thousands of
Right.
years now. Um, but it does sound like I'm at least again, I don't fully agree with Neeson's sentiment there. It's obviously a little bit of folk psychology, but I think that he's on to something, and it says
Mhm.
maybe a little more sympathetic, and you're maybe a little less sympathetic.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, I think I'll just close this point out with my review of Deadpool 2. Which, I mean, that movie is all about a character who, if he does a violent act, will then destroy the world later. The Russell character, if he does a violent act, he's going to destroy the planet. And yet, throughout the entire film, Deadpool and Cable and all of the other people are kind of killing people just for fun. But they're not, like, it's okay for them, but it's not okay for this other person. Like, that's the type of unethical portrayal of violence, or at least internally contradictory portrayal of violence that I'm particularly noticing. And that kind of runs against my objections toward Deadpool 2's violence, kind of run against the same type of point that Neeson is bringing up. A point that justly, rightly, I understand why people were talking about the first paragraph and all of that stuff. Like, that makes perfect sense why people were talking about that. But this part of it was overlooked, and this has something a little bit more to do with some of the news items that we talk about on the podcast. So.
There was no movie that could have done for Liam Neeson what he needed to have done for him after hearing about his friend being raped. That was
Right.
movies cannot, no artwork can play that kind of role, tragically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it cannot release that pressure valve the way Freud describes it, so to speak. Okay, so that was fun. Let's talk about next week's episode of Jim and Garrett at the Movies. It's opening Lego Movie 2. And so we will be reviewing Lego Movie 2 in our movie club. We encourage everybody to watch this film if you haven't already seen it. Toy Story. We'll be talking about Lego Movie 2, reviewing that one, and our movie club will be Toy Story. So until next week, I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this has been
Jim and
Garrett
at the Movies.
Good night.